I've been asked to talk about some of the issues relating to the international agenda, and particularly what's happened in the developments around domestic violence at work as a global issue, and the work that's being carried out by the International Labour Organization and UNWomen in particular. So I just want to start by just raising just a few points about why domestic violence at work has become an issue about the world of work. And sometimes, you know, when we talk to employers and they say, well, domestic violence isn't anything to do with us at all. Domestic violence happens in the private realm. So I just wanted to say a few words to start with, just about why this is such an important issue. Now, for some of you, this is a new topic, I understand, but for a lot of you, this is just rehearsing some of the points that you already know very well about why this has become a workplace issue. So when we talk about domestic violence, we talk about not just physical violence, but we're talking about sexual, psychological, and increasingly we're talking about things like coercive control, we're talking about economic and financial violence. And there are often hidden forms of violence that aren't, I don't know if that, maybe I should turn that off. Whether it's commonly viewed that domestic violence is something that is physical, it's about having the punch in the face and the black eye. I think we understand much better today that domestic violence is a long-term process, often of coercive and psychological control. And legislation is being introduced in a number of countries across the world of coercive control as being an aspect of domestic violence, as recently happened in the UK and Ireland. I don't know about in Canada. Have you coercive control in the legislation yet? It'll come, I'm sure. But it involves a whole series of patterns of control over women's social interactions, around her autonomy. It can be about the control of children, of parenting, and so on. And it can have devastating financial and psychological consequences for women. And I think we often talk about financial abuse as being really crucial for employers, particularly to understand today, because without financial independence, women suffering from domestic violence find it very, very difficult to leave a violent relationship. So financial independence, keeping women in work, staying in work, becomes increasingly important as a strategy of governments and of employers. And I think, as the ILO has noted, work can be both preventative and protective. And I think that's important because surveys have shown that actually women feel safer at work than they do at home, that the workplace can sometimes be a place of safety, but it can also be a place of great danger, because often that violence follows the women into the workplace, and we know there's femicide that happens on a common basis in many countries in the workplace itself. Those of you that work in domestic violence know that the 2 weeks after a woman has left a violent relationship are sometimes the most dangerous for her. And that's where the workplace and security and safety in the workplace becomes really important. So, increasingly at the global level, the workplace is seen as a point of entry for helping both to prevent domestic violence, but also to give safety and security to women to stay in work. And I think that's really important to recognise, that that can sometimes be the door that opens. And I've interviewed quite a lot of women who've experienced domestic violence, and they've said it was actually the conversation that they had with their colleague or with their manager that enabled them to get out of their violent relationship and to build up the confidence to be able to do that. So if we train managers and we give managers the tools to enable them to have empathetic and understandable conversations with women, it's really important as a strategy for helping to prevent domestic violence. One of many strategies, and we have to see this as being multiple strategies, of which the workplace is one. So it's having an independent income is an important pathway. And I just want to put up this because Barb Macquarie drew this up, and it's now being used at the international level And I think it's a really useful tool because it's based on the power and control wheel that many of you perhaps have seen that was drawn up in Duluth many, many years ago. And many of us have referred to this model for a long time. But what Barb did here and her team did was to make the wheel relevant in relation to domestic violence at work. And it's now being used at the international level. And I think it's kind of sums up extremely well all of the different dimensions. And you can see the, it's economic abuse, it's control of children, it's psychological abuse, it's intimidation, and so on. And it's not what you would normally think about as being abuse taking place in the workplace, but it's the way that it impacts on the workplace that is really important. So it's simple things sometimes, like the fact that the woman can't get to work because her keys have been hidden, or her purse has been hidden, or her bus ticket or bus pass has been destroyed, or because the equipment that she needs to carry out her work has been destroyed. I interviewed one woman who 10 years later recounted her story to me, and she was actually a senior member of a company and had progressed into a senior position, and she told the story of how she had experienced a whole series and patterns of domestic violence and abuse. And she talked about her company being absolutely critical to her to getting out of her abusive relationship. And it was the conversation she had with her manager that was the critical part of it. And in fact, in this context, she was also supported by a trade union representative. Another woman I interviewed told me about a situation several years prior to the interview where she had been coercively controlled for many, many years. And in fact, it's an example that is in a recent toolkit that we've developed around some case studies. And I always think it's a really interesting example because her colleagues went to her manager and her colleagues said, "We can't work with this woman anymore. She's a very nice person, but we can't work with her because she has the most terrible body odour." And they were working in an office together and they were finding it really difficult. So her manager talked to her and she said, "Do you know, is there something happening at home? Is there anything we can help you with?" She knew that there must be something happening. And the woman didn't say anything for a while, but after several months she talked to her manager and she said, "Actually, my husband won't let me wash or wear clean clothes." And it revealed a pattern of control and abuse that for the first time in her life she was able to talk about. And she talked to her manager and she talked to her colleagues in the office. They developed a safety plan for her. And eventually, many years later, she had left her violent relationship. And I think that was an example that kind of exemplified coercive control that isn't immediately obvious a problem in the workplace. And one of the issues that we often talk about in training is to spot something that maybe is kind of different behaviour, different patterns of clothing, different patterns of care for yourself, different patterns of attendance at work that may signify that there's a problem at home. And that problem might not be domestic violence. That problem could be something like, it could be drugs, it could be alcohol, it could be a whole range of problems, but it might just be domestic violence. And don't let any situation escape you as a possibility for looking at the problem. So the power and control wheel, for those of you that are involved in domestic abuse and domestic violence work, is very useful in terms of awareness raising in the workplace. Sometimes the issues that we need to focus on with companies are the costs. What are the costs for victims and the costs for companies of domestic violence in the workplace? When we say domestic violence in the workplace, the spillover into the workplace. Studies across the world, this is a kind of rough estimate bringing together all of the studies, is that 30 to 40% of working women have experienced domestic violence and abuse at some time during their working lives. That's a significant number of the workforce. And I mentioned the issues about coercive control and so on. But I think what we're getting much more evidence about now is that domestic violence and abuse affects work performance. It ultimately impacts on the capacity of a victim to be able to stay in work, Because actually those of you that work in refuges, for example, by the time a woman gets to a refuge, usually she's given up work. And that's certainly in our experience in Europe. And I was just recently at a refuge in Copenhagen in Denmark. And we were just talking about how to integrate women back into the workplace. And every single woman in that refuge had given up work during her experience of domestic violence. So keeping women in work, giving them support is crucial here. The costs of domestic violence. I'm not going to go into the details of this because we'll probably run out of time, but you'll have the slides, I think. Will everybody have the slides? I mean, we're talking about billions of dollars here. We're not just talking about small costs. We are talking about billions of dollars on enterprises and companies, of productivity losses, of loss through skilled workforces, through loss of costs in terms of training, reintegration of new workers, of hiring new workers. So we need to be looking at also how employers can be persuaded to develop good policies and procedures that also take account of the fact that this is good for their business. There are business benefits for it. I've been asked to talk a little bit about some of the issues relating to the UN and the ILO. I'm not sure how much people know about the United Nations and the work that they're involved in and the ILO, but maybe I'll just give a very brief summary. I mean, as you know, probably the United Nations has a women's entity called UNWomen that's had a very long history of working on domestic violence within the home, but not within the workplace. And it's only recently that UNWomen has begun to look at this issue in relation to the workplace. And it's included a whole range of provisions on standards for legislation, on support services, as well as funding many domestic violence initiatives in developing countries. And through the women's empowerment principles, I don't know if you've come across, I have a slide, I'll just go on to this slide here first. You might have heard about the Women's Empowerment Principles. They were developed by the United Nations General Secretary with UN Women on the basis of creating a network of companies globally that adhere to a set of principles around gender equality, of which one or two focus very specifically on gender-based violence. And I'll just go back to my earlier slides in a moment. But I just wanted to say that the Women's Empowerment Principles, there's probably a lot of Canadian companies, I don't know how many, but most large companies now sign up to the WEPs. And it's really trying to encourage companies to take on a role in gender-based violence, on other gender equality issues. Although, and I would just in brackets argue here that they don't involve a kind of social dialogue approach, and the unions have been kind of kept out of the dialogue that takes place around the WEPs. So in trying to promote collective and partnership approaches, one of the issues is trying to find ways of ensuring that the WEPs in the future integrate social dialogue as a tool for achieving gender equality, so that there's a partnership in the workplace. And in relation to the United Nations, you're probably aware of CEDAW, which is the Convention on Eliminating Discrimination Against Women. When CEDAW was first passed, it didn't include anything specifically on gender-based violence, but it was further elaborated back in 1992 when they have a CEDAW committee, and they can develop general recommendations that kind of elaborate on what's in a convention. And they ask states parties to include in this general recommendation requirements on governments to collect statistics on domestic violence, information on provision of services and support for victims of domestic violence, legislative and other measures. And these are now included in the in the CEDAW reports that each government implements. And I would recommend you look at your CEDAW reports when they happen on a periodic basis, just to see what the comments are coming from the UN committee. And then in 1993, there was a declaration on the elimination of violence against women. There were attempts at the time to get a strong treaty in place, but it's voluntary, so it is not binding on governments. But it does ask governments to put in place measures to end violence against women. So there's a kind of long history and tradition of working on this issue, and it's only just recently that the UNWomen and ILO started working together on this issue. And the ILO is the International Labour Organization based in Geneva. It's a tripartite body, and it's involved in, I don't know how many are familiar with the ILO. A few nods, you've come across it, yeah. Seems a bit distant. It's a bit like the human rights framework. It seems very abstract. We have to find ways of making it real on the ground. But the ILO is a specialist body of the United Nations. It's going through its centenary year this year, so it's 100 years old. And it has the remit to promote employment, decent work, and social justice. So it's kind of got a very broad-based approach related to employment. And it has a tripartite structure made up of employers, the workers, and the governments. So they have to work together to find tripartite solutions, which isn't always easy. The governing body is meeting at the moment, and they have a remit to develop new provisions where they become necessary. And one of the new provisions, or what they call standards, international labour standards, is the proposal for a new convention on violence and harassment against women and men in the world of work. And I'm going to say a few words about that in a moment. And there's quite a lot of mobilisation around that. So this is the outcome of some new collaboration between UNWomen and ILO. It's the first time they've ever worked together on an issue like this. And it's been interesting because it's brought the two areas of expertise, of treaty rights, of conventions, of legal knowledge together in one initiative. And the handbook, and we can give you the link to it tomorrow, was launched in New York last week, and Vicky Smallman from the CLC was one of the panel speakers at the launch of it. And it looks at best practices from across the world, including, I might add, quite a lot of very good practices from Canada. And we often look to some of your good practices in Canada as being some of the best practices in the world, and particularly around the issue of domestic violence at work, with your Ontario legislation is one of the best practices pieces of legislation across the world. So we all want what you have in Ontario. But also, I think some of the very innovative projects that have emerged in Canada, for example, the UNIFOR Women's Advocate Programme, which I think is just one of the, it's such a kind of wonderful, practical example of what you can do to make a difference in the workplace, where workplace representatives are trained up to give confidential advice and support to women victims of domestic violence. And there's an example of UNIFOR's programme in the handbook as well. So just in terms of what's in the handbook, in terms of some promising practices about workplace policies, I thought because what we did was to bring all of the good practices together from across the world, and then to look at what actually is a good practice approach to dealing with this issue of how to draw up a policy, a programme, prevention measures on domestic violence at work. And I wanted to just go through some of these with you because actually they represent an amalgam of what is best practice. So having safety and security measures in the workplace around safety planning is a really important factor if there are risks of domestic violence following you into the workplace. Training of workplace representatives, of safety and health representatives, of line managers and colleagues and others, so that they know how to identify domestic violence in the workplace, how to have, in a way, how to identify the warning signs, but also how to know how to approach a woman in the workplace. And sometimes what happens is that workplace representatives want to go in and solve the problem straight away, because that's what workplace representatives and trade union representatives have been trained to do. But actually around domestic violence, it might be months or years before a woman is prepared to even disclose. Or even if she does disclose to somebody in the workplace, it may be a long time before she's able even to leave a violent partner. So it takes a whole different approach. It requires a lot of training and empathy for people to know how best to deal with the issue. And also for managers and trade union representatives and other people giving support in the workplace to know at what stage do you stop giving that support and pass on to a specialist domestic violence organisation, for example. At what stage do you stop your intervention and know when it is safe for you to continue that intervention and when to stop? And the part of the difficulty, I think, in some companies is that there's been a very strong emphasis on solving the problem. The manager wants to solve the problem. And actually that doesn't work. In fact, it has the opposite effect in many cases. So the training around empathy, around communication skills is absolutely crucial. And some of the best practices across the world are when domestic violence organisations have come into the workplace and trained managers to do that. Early intervention is absolutely crucial, because one of the things, those of you that work in domestic violence know that domestic violence often starts with something very small, and it's incremental. It builds up year on year on year, and actually in the worst cases there's femicide. So thinking about best practices, how early intervention can be implemented. And I just love your example from Bolivia of, the wonderful awareness raising of the little box with you're safe and there's somebody to talk to. And making sure, and I think this is why the work that Nadej is doing with the companies across Europe, of making sure that there's somebody to talk to, somebody that is trusted, so that women can feel that they're able to disclose at an early stage. And there's some really wonderful examples across the world of how that's been done in a very positive way. So intervene early before it escalates. The next issue that is really growing in much more importance, and I have to say some really, really good examples across the world now, in Canada, in Australia, in the UK, in several global companies, of providing flexible paid or unpaid leave for victims of domestic violence. And what we would love to see in the future is that right to paid leave gets enshrined into legislation. They've enshrined it in legislation in several European countries already, but New Zealand is the first country in the world to give 10 days paid leave as a right in the legislation. So that's something we all want to be replicating. And it might be that the paid leave is, taken up flexibly. It could be an hour here, half an hour there. It could be a day. It could be specifically for court attendances, meetings with the police. It could be issues around counselling and support services and giving women access to that leave if she needs to settle her children into a new home or a new school and so on. So some very good examples across the world of paid leave being institutionalised into work policies. Protection for dismissal. I think some of the examples from Spain are in the Spanish legislation is really good, that women can be protected for dismissal for up to 2 years, which is pretty impressive, even if she leaves the workplace on a temporary basis. So making sure that, and one of the really interesting things is that several companies across the world now are looking at their sick leave policies, because often women with high rates of sick leave could possibly also be victims of domestic violence. So looking at that and making sure that there's a possibility to protect women from dismissal if they have been absent for a long time. Designating trusted trained persons in the workplace. This is where UNIFOR is one of several good examples, so that victims have a possibility to disclose and seek help. psychological and practical support for victims, where the employer actually provides counselling or referrals to specialist domestic violence or other specialist organisations. And then financial support is an area that some companies are beginning to develop, and some of the banks are now doing this as well, which is really interesting, because a lot of the aspects of domestic abuse, during we're on the power and control wheel, are about financial abuse. So if you discover that your bank account has been fleeced, if you're thinking about leaving a violent relationship and there's no money left in the bank account, what do you do? How do you pay the rent? How do you get out? So the big issue now for the banks is to give debt forgiveness to women if, for example, debts have been run out, because that's actually turning out to be quite a significant area of financial abuse for women. So debt forgiveness, giving women loans for employers who are, in some cases, giving a month's or 2 months' salary in advance to enable women to have enough money to pay the rent. And then in some cases, just giving women some money to enable them to, there's some companies in Spain who have policies where they will pay the first month's rent and the deposit to enable a woman to have some security. And then there's a whole area of ensuring that there are acceptable disciplinary procedures that are consistent around perpetrators in the workplace as well. Because we have to remember, when we talk about the costs of domestic violence, we're not just talking about the costs of victims, we're talking about the costs of perpetrators also, who take up workplace time in abusing women. So it's about having relevant sanctions, such as dismissal, in a consistent way. So that, and you've probably heard of the notion that many companies support and keep their high-value employees, men, who may sexually harass or who may be perpetrators of other forms of violence. They're high-value employees because they bring in money, they bring in resources, not to be protecting the high-value employees and just ensuring that those disciplinary procedures are applied in a very consistent way. And there's lots of examples in the joint handbook. And I just want to raise this issue about social dialogue, because it's really an important aspect of, and I'm going to be running out of time soon, so I'm just going to say it's really important. Please read the slides. And there's some references at the bottom. And if you're interested in social dialogue, there's a couple of really good reports that you can read on this. But unless we have social dialogue and a partnership between workers and employers, and a role for the trade unions in supporting and promoting collective bargaining agreements, we won't get the workplace solutions that we need. And there's lots of evidence. And the OECD and ILO Global Deal have this flagship report now on social dialogue to say this is absolutely crucial for workplace measures that are going to be consistent, best practice, and are going to benefit the workers in particular. And I mentioned the women's empowerment principles, and I won't say any more about these either, because I'm going to run out of time, but I just wanted to flag up that, and there's a link to the website there that you can look at in more detail. And now I just want to come on to the standard setting process in the ILO, because this is probably the most interesting for many of you at the moment. As I mentioned earlier, the ILO is a tripartite organisation. The governing body 4 years ago agreed that there would be a series of negotiations for a global standard on violence and harassment against women and men in the world of work. And it came from a concern about rising levels of violence at work, rising levels of sexual harassment. Actually, this happened before the Me Too movement started. But also a recognition that actually a global standard is really important for those countries, particularly that either have no legislation or have inadequate legislation. So the new standard, and those of you that are not so familiar with the ILO process, there's 2 forms of standard. There's a convention, and the convention puts obligations on governments to implement legislation and procedures and so on. and the convention has to be ratified. So even if we get a convention, and there's not a certainty 100%, we have to make sure that it's ratified. The Canadian government, incidentally, has been very positive in this whole process. And then the other standard is a recommendation, which is purely what it is. So there's been an international campaign, there's been a series of global negotiations for this international standard with a strong focus on gender-based violence. And you'll be glad to hear a focus on domestic violence at work. And Barb and I were both in the, and Vicky and a few others were in the first tripartite negotiation and discussion. And in the end, everybody agreed that domestic violence should be included in this new standard. And it was quite a breakthrough, because for a lot of governments and a lot of employers, it was really something very new to them. Now, I just want to just note what is likely to be in the negotiations. This is actually what was agreed at the Standard Setting Committee last June. And since then, there has been a draft convention that has been published. And in fact, when I wrote this presentation, it was before the most recent report has been launched, which contains the new proposal for the new convention. And the wording in the proposed convention is virtually the same as what was agreed at the Standard Setting Committee last year, which is huge. It's really huge that it wasn't watered down any more significantly, because there are various aspects of the proposed convention that have already been watered down quite significantly. So I just want to flag up these ones here. The measures to address the effective domestic violence in the world of work referred to as above should include, now this would be in a convention, if it's ratified, that's massive. Paid leave for victims of domestic violence, flexible work hours, temporary or permanent transfers of victims to other forms, to other workplaces, workplace risk assessments, a referral system for public mitigation measures, awareness raising about the effects of domestic violence. If this gets into the new convention, we will have a global legal obligation on governments across the world to implement these measures. It's only in the last 4 or 5 years, really, that this issue has been discussed in companies. I mean, I know, Barb, you've been working on this for many years. But it's only in the last 2 or 3 years that the issue has come onto the agenda, and I think this is really a great moment in our history to see this happening. And I just wanted to give, I know I saw a sign saying I have to finish in a moment. I just wanted to mention one example of something happening at the global level. Sorry. And it's just recently Vodafone, the mobile phone provider. I think mobile. Do you have Vodafone in Canada? No, but they're in 44 markets across the world. So they're one of the biggest mobile phone providers. They decided to have a global policy, and they decided to go for 10 days paid domestic violence leave. Every single one of their markets now has 10 days domestic violence leave, including Egypt, Qatar, some of the markets that you wouldn't imagine for one moment would have those policies. They've done a survey, they have a toolkit, they've done training, and it's very, very impressive what they've done. And this is where it all started in New Zealand, because the New Zealand domestic violence policy in Vodafone was one of the best in the country, and it inspired further action. I'll leave that for you to read later as well. And this is the model, which is, I think, just a useful model to be using in any of your work. And it's a model that originated in the USA, I think, Barb. Not quite sure where it came from, but it's based on the 3 dimensions of recognizing the problem, how you recognize the problem, how you respond to the problem within the workplace, and how you refer, and when you refer onto domestic violence agencies, specialist supports. And the refer model also refers to partnerships with domestic violence organisations and workplaces. And finally, just to say, there's the campaign in terms of the possible, we hope, new ILO Convention, which will be agreed this June at the International Labour Conference in Geneva. And for those of you interested, it's the Stop Gender-Based Violence at Work campaign. Barb, maybe we can give the links to the campaign and a couple of other things on tomorrow. But it's a great campaign, and there's lots of resources, and it keeps you in touch with what's happening. And then that's just one of the posters from the campaign. So thank you very much.